Hello guys, in this video we are going to learn how to perform CRUD operations in Nestjs. We are going to make use of TypeORM and MySQL database. Just to point out, the approach we are going to take here will apply to whichever SQL database you use, for example Postgres, SQLite, etc. So what we are going to do is to create a Nest application, and then we configure database connection using TypeORM. Then we create entities which are going to be mapped to the tables in our database. And after that, we go ahead to see how to create, read, update, and delete. Alright, let's get into it. Before we proceed, you need to already have MySQL installed in your machine. Installing and setting up MySQL is outside the scope of our next tutorials, so you need to get that installed and ready to connect. Then another thing you can do is to install the Nestjs CLI, which we can use to generate a new project and do other stuff. So you can check the Nest documentation. It is actually straightforward to install the CLI and ready to use. To generate a new project, we use the command nest new and then the project name. So I'll head over to the terminal where I want to create the project, and I'll say nest new. Let's call this a CRUD app and hit enter. Then we are presented with option whether to use npm or yarn. I'll go ahead with npm. Then we wait for the installation to complete. The installation has completed. I will cd into the project, cd CRUD app, then open that in the code editor. I'm using VS Code. Before we go further, let's just run our application to be sure that everything is installed properly. So we can say npm run start dev. This will start the application in watch mode to watch for changes and update. The app has started. We can check it out by visiting localhost 3000 on the browser to see the output. So our installation is okay. Let me stop the server and go ahead with some configuration. The first thing we want to do is to install TypeORM and those dependencies we need for database connection. This is going to install TypeORM and MySQL. So I'll copy this command and head over to the project and run it. Then we wait for the dependencies to get installed. Now we have TypeORM and MySQL added. Let's see how to connect to the database using those. So over here is an example connection. We are going to make use of this for now, but we are going to change some things later. So I'll copy this. This is what we need. I'll copy from TypeORM module.forroot. Head over to the project. Let me close this one. Head over to the project src folder and then app.module.ts. In the imports array is where we want to, not there, this is where we want to paste the configuration that we got from the documentation, and make sure to import the TypeORM module. So let's look at what we have for this configuration. The first item here is where we specify the database we want to connect to. In this example, MySQL, you can see there are other options, MariaDB, MongoDB, Postgres, etc. But for our use case, we are making use of MySQL. And then you have your specific database connection credentials. The host is localhost. I'm okay with that. Port 3306 And then username root, that's the username of my database. Password, I'm not using any password for my database connection. And database, I have a database named demo, which I want to use for this. We are going to come back to password later because we don't want our password committed to in the code, right? We want to manage that, let's say in the .env file as an environment variable. Then entities is where we're going to specify the classes that should be used to create or map to the tables in our database. For example, let's say we have user entity and we have payment entity. This is where we specify those entities that should be used to map to the tables in our database. We can also tell TypeORM the pattern it can use to auto-detect the entity files in our code base. And then synchronize. This is when we want to automatically synchronize the entities with the database. What that means is when we define an entity, for example, user that has the field ID, name, password, etc. If we set synchronize to true, then TypeORM will automatically generate the corresponding tables in our database with all those fields as the columns. And when we make changes in the entity file, those changes are also synchronized or reflected in the respective database table. One thing you should take note of is that this synchronize that is set to true is generally not used in production or in real project. While for a demonstration like this, it can be very helpful, it is better to take migration approach when working on a real project. But migration is outside the scope of this lesson, so we're not going to talk about migrations and all that. At this point, I want to save the file and run the application again to make sure that this connection is okay. If it is not okay, I'm going to get an error when I try to run the application. So let me run the app one more time. And okay, the application started. Let me try to use credentials that are not correct. For example, put password here, save, and run this again. So I am not able to connect to the database because the credentials are not correct. I will revert this, so our connection is working as expected. Now let's go back to what I talked about earlier about having the password in the environment variables. Although my connection does not use any password, but in case your own uses it, what we're going to do is to create a .env file in the root. So I will create a .env file. Then here I want to have db_password to be equal to empty. Here you specify your own password. I'll leave it empty. But before this can actually work, let's do it the Nestjs way. So to make use of environment variables the Nestjs way, what we can do is to install the config module that we can use to read from environment variables. I will copy this. Let me stop this server, paste it over here, and we install the config module. The installation has completed. How do we make use of it? We go to the imports array of the root module and list the config module there. So what I will do is to go to src app module. Then over here, I can put it at the top anywhere, it doesn't matter. But let me leave it at the top and make sure to import the config module. This is imported. By default, it is going to look for a file .env as we have it. If you want to customize your own differently, you can take a look at the documentation to see how to do that. With the config module setup, we can now modify this database connection to read from the env file. For that, I'm going to use this for root async approach that allows us to inject the config service. This config service comes from the config module that we just installed. I'll copy this, head over to the code, and replace the TypeORM options here. So we make sure to import config service, which comes from the config module. Here we have something similar to what we had before now. We are connecting to MySQL, but we are now making use of the config service to get things from the env file. For password, I have db password. So I'm going to change it to db password. We are going to add additional ones. Let's call this db_name, and in .env, let's have that as well. db name, my database name is demo, and db username, my username is root. Come on, what just happened? Root. And let's call this db port. Port should be 3306. And finally, db host, which should be localhost. Localhost. We save that. I think I have a typo here. It should be comma. Okay. We save the changes and try to connect to the database again. I will run npm run start dev. And once again, we have our database connection. That means that our application is now reading from the .env. To prove that, let me use a database name that does not exist. I will stop and start the application again. We try to connect and we get a failure. Let me stop this and revert the changes. So now we are reading the database credentials from the config file. The next thing I want to do is to generate a resource. This will just give us some boilerplate for our CRUD implementation. To do that, I will use the Nest CLI, Nest generate resource called to do's. We'll wait for that. Nothing happened. So I don't know why I'm not able to generate resource with the command. I've tried to update my Nest CLI in case that is the issue, but it's not working. What I will do is to wire things up manually instead. So here I'm going to create a folder for to-dos. Then the first thing I want to do is to create the module. Let's call that to-dos.module.ts. So here I will export class to do. Let me minimize this. To do module. For this to qualify as a module, we use the decorator module imported from Nestjs common. Save that. Then the next thing I want to do is to create the entity file. I'll create a file called todos.entity.ts. Let me name this to do. Here I will export class to do, and for this to qualify as an entity class, we use the annotation at entity like that. You can give the table a name if you don't want the auto-generated name. So let's call this to-dos. That should be our table name. And then in the module, okay, before we do that, we need to wire up this module in the base module, that is in the app module. So here in the app module, we come over here and just list it out, to do module. Do I have a mistake somewhere? No. Okay, that is automatically imported up here, our to do module. What we have here is an entity that has no fields that will be mapped to the to-dos table. Let's go ahead and specify some fields. The first one I want to have is ID field. That should be mapped to the ID column in the database. Then I want to have title. This should be a string. You can have other things you want to have here, but this should be enough for our demonstration. I want this ID field to be primary key auto-generated. So for that we use the primary, yeah, this should be it, imported from the TypeORM module. Here I just have column. So this is also a column, but a special column, the primary key auto-generated column. This is another column we are going to have in the table, that is in to-dos table. You can override the name, you can set other options. So to do that, to learn more about all these options, you can take a look at the TypeORM official documentation. There are more things you can do here, but let's keep it simple so we can move fast to performing some actions. The next thing we are going to do is to import TypeORM module in the to-dos module and list the entities for that module. What that means is in to-dos module we have only one entity, now the to-do entity. So we head over to to-dos module. Here we say import. So in the imports array we want to have typeORM module.official, then an array. Let me format this. Inside this array we list out the entities we are interested in this module. So here we say to do, that is the entity we just created. There are different ways to configure work with TypeORM. We are using the one called the repository pattern, where each of our entity has its own repository. All right. Before we complete the setup for TypeORM, there is one more thing we need to do. If you remember when we talked about these entities, we said that this is where we can list the entities for our application, right? For example, we have to do now. We can just come here and say to do, but I'm going to change this because if you have 100 entities, you don't want to, maybe it's not so convenient to come here and make sure that all the entities are listed out. But for now, I'm going to leave it like this and try to start the application again. I will come on, start, and we wait for the application to start. Over to the database, I'm going to refresh. So you can see that our table has been created with the fields specified in our entity class. This is the ID field, that is the primary auto-generated field, and then we have the title column. When we build an app, our project, or when we run the npm run start dev as we've been doing, it is going to build the app into the dist folder, as we can see here, right? So what I want to do is to tell TypeORM to automatically recognize all the .entity.js file as our entity class. So instead of listing out all the entity files here, we can do something like this. I'm going to paste the example. make sure to import path from path. So what this is doing is saying, go into the dist folder and all the entity.js file, all the .entity.js file should be treated as entity file. So this is going to work similar to what we had when we had to list out the entity files. To demonstrate this, let me first of all delete what I have here in the database. Refresh, that is gone. Dismiss. Now I will start the server again and we watch TypeORM. I think there is a mistake somewhere. I think it's the way I imported part. I'm gonna figure that out later. Okay, let me import join like this. Refresh. Now the application is up and running again. If I refresh here, you can see that we have the table created again. So we have successfully connected to the database and we are able to generate table thanks to this dangerous synchronize that we set to true here. The next thing now is to start doing our CRUD operations. Now let's create our to-dos service. I will go to to-dos folder and create a file called todos.service.ts at injectable export class to-dos service. Let's have a constructor where we can inject the TypeORM repository. So inside the constructor we say at inject repository, then for which entity? Our to-do entity, to-do. Let's call this to-dos repository or to-do repository of generic type repository to-do. So with this we have access to TypeORM repository for our to-do entity. Let's have a method for creating a to-do. We can call that create, and inside here I want to say const to-do to be equal to this dot to-do repository. I think I'm missing something. Private read-only. Okay, this dot to-do repository dot create. A to-do requires title. The ID is auto-generated. But instead of hard coding stuff here, let's have DTO, which is going to be of type title string. This is something you can do with something like class validator, and then have that passed over from the controller and all that. Okay, so we are expecting a type that has title within it. So here I can replace this with DTO. At this point we are not done, so the next thing we need to do is const, let's call it result or just return await this dot repository dot save our to-do to save the result in the database. Because this is asynchronous, we need to declare this function as async. We save that. Then let's have a controller for our to-dos. To-dos.controller.ts. Here we say export class to-dos controller. Then once again we have constructor and we inject our to-dos service. Private to-dos service, come on. to-dos service. Here let's have a method create. So let's we basically use the to-do service that we injected in the constructor. So we can just say return this dot to-do service dot create. Now this is expecting title, which is a string. Let's say cook food. Ideally this should come from the request, so the user input, instead of hard coding it here. For that we can just make use of the request body. Actually the syntax is at body. And we pass that over to the method create. So as it stands, our DTO is of type any, but this needs a certain type. So what we can do is to refactor our code a little bit. I'm going to end up creating a folder for DTOs. Then I'll head over here. No need for copying that. I'm going to have in the DTOs folder create -to-do.dto.ts export class create to-do DTO. This is going to have title of type string. So what I can do is to go over to the service method and type hint this like so, create to do. I will do something similar for the controller. Here I will say create to do, and the warning goes away. For this class to qualify as a controller, we need to decorate it with @controller. Yeah, that's correct. And for the route handler for our method, this has to be a post request. So we say @post. Then our route prefix for everything to do's, let's have to do's. These are just Nestjs stuff. I will save that. What I'll try to do is to start the application again and try to create a to-do by hitting that endpoint. So let me change something here. Not Spring. Okay, whatever the name. I'm going to change this to localhost 3000, which is where our application is running. This is just some Postman stuff. And I'm going to hit the endpoint /todos, localhost 3000 /todos with the required payload. And let's see what happens. Hit the endpoint, we get a 404. Okay. This is to-dos. So I think the reason for the 404 is that we have not wired up our controllers in the to-dos module. To do that, we say controllers and we list out our controller. So to-do controller, and we also need the providers, that is the injectables. In this case we have to-dos service. Now we save that and try again to hit the endpoint. We still get a 404. Why do I still have a 404? To-dos localhost. Oh, I have a typo here. This is to-dos. Save that and try one more time. So you can see that we get a response with the ID. That means that our to-dos has been created and inserted in the database. To verify that, let me quickly open it up. So this is our demo database. If I go to to-dos, you can see we have a record there. So we have successfully created our to-do. Let's move over to the next thing, that is to update a to-do. Or let's fetch the record first. Instead of calling this read, let's just call it find all or find many. This is basically going to return all the to-dos we have in our database. So for this, I'm going to say there are different ways to query the database. Let me use this syntax: return this dot to-dos repository dot find. Inside the find, we can specify options to filter things down. For example, we can say where ID is equal to 1, but this is TypeORM stuff. You can check TypeORM documentations for how to do all these queries. Okay, so I have a method find many. I will head over to the controller. Let's have that. That should be to-dos controller. Let me copy this quickly, paste it down here. This is going to be a get request to /todos endpoint. Let's call it find many. We are not expecting any input here, so find many. I will save that. The server is up and running. Head over to Postman and hit that endpoint to find many. So we get our list of available to-dos. Let's create another one. Let's call it sleep. We send the request, go to find again, and okay, I think we filtered by ID over here. So let me remove this. We can get all the records. Send the request again, and we have the 2 records. Alright guys, so let's look at the next item. Please guys, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you have not done so. Thank you as you do that. The next thing we have to do is to update. So let's just reuse these because they are similar. The payload for create and the one for update is similar. So I'm going to use the clear syntax for this, which involves first of all getting the record from the database and then update. So let's say const to do to be equal to await this dot repository dot find by ID. Find one. There should be find one. Yeah, find one. This should take the ID of the item we are looking for. So let's have ID here, that is a number, and we specify the ID. Actually, the syntax takes a where clause, where ID is equal to the ID supplied. Once again, this is async, so we say async. You can do your check to be sure record exists, but let's keep validations and all those stuff in this tutorial. So here I'm going to say object.assign. You can set this manually anyhow you want to do it. To do and our DTO. Object.assign to copy over those records. And finally, we can say this or return this dot repository dot save our to do. We await this. Finally, we return the to do. Let's head over to Postman and give this a try. Let me check. I think this returns to do, so this is going to return the entity. I'll put the return statement here. Let's head over to Postman and we go to the update. Let's have title, and then the ID is the to do with ID 2, the second record here. I will hit the endpoint. Okay, we don't have our controller method, so let's add that. Head over to here. Let's have at hash. Is that what we are calling here? Put. Okay, let's use put. Put. Let's call it update. And this should be update. We need the ID, and that is going to be in our path. So we say put colon ID. Here we grab the ID with @param ID of type number, and down here we say ID and then the DTO. I will save that and try to call the endpoint again. So we get the update successful. Now if I refresh this for item number 2, our update has been performed. Now let's do another step, which is to delete a record. To delete a record, this time let me start from the controller. I'm going to have a delete that will take the ID and takes no request body. Let's call it delete, and we are going to have a method delete in the service class. So in the service class, let me reuse this guy, delete, which takes, and down here I want to just say, I think remove, yeah, remove. So there are different TypeORM syntaxes that you can decide not to fetch the record before performing an action on it. So this should remove the record. Let me go back here. I think I have an error, not an error, just. So let's try the delete. I'm going to add another record. Okay, the server is down. Start the server. I'm going to add another record with ID 3, and over here we can see the item with ID 3. And what I want to do here is to delete that record. So we get a response. Why did we get any response at all? Delete. Let me see. I was assuming that this should return something else instead of the. Okay. So let's try to fetch the record again. We can see that item with ID 3 is gone. Alright guys, this completes our CRUD operation and the things we said we are going to cover in this lesson. Let me just quickly recap some of the key points that we have covered. So we created a project, a Nest project, using the CLI, and then we configured our TypeORM module. In the app module, here we are connecting to MySQL database using these credentials. The credentials are located in the .env file, which we are able to make use of in the configuration using the config module that Nestjs provides. And here we want to, instead of listing out all the entities, which is an option, we want to automatically discover the entity files using some specified patterns. And we say that you should never use this in a real project, but because the migration is out of the scope of this tutorial, so we are making use of this synchronize set to true. You can set it to false or remove it entirely, which is the default. But for the purpose of this demonstration, we are making use of the synchronize set to true. And then we have seen how to create an entity. We said that entity is what is going to be represented in our database tables. For this example, we have only to-dos. If we have another one, let me quickly add one more. Let's call that category. Doesn't matter, just call it anything. And here I can say category, and let me remove the name so that TypeORM will automatically generate it. Let's just have anything here. Then we say that when we have an entity, we have to list them out in the module of interest. So in this module, I'm going to have another entity called category. Then when I start the server again, we are going to have all those entities created according to the mapping that we are using here. Wait for the server to start, go to the database and refresh. You can see that we have category in addition to to-dos. Then we moved on to perform some CRUD operations, as we have seen in the to-do service. In the controller, we inject the repository that we are in, for the entity we are interested in, and we can begin to make use of what TypeORM provides. Once again, you can take a look at the TypeORM documentation to learn TypeORM syntaxes. Alright guys, this wraps it up. I hope it makes sense. Until next time, happy coding.